Have you ever been in such a spot where the only way out is a miracle? I have. And let me tell you something. Everybody loves to look back on a miracle story, but 10 minutes before the miracle happens, it is panic time. And the reason for that is you and I are not equipped to handle miracle quality work. A few years ago, I was in Japan on an outreach and we were doing evangelistic ministries. But one of the things we really felt in prayer was that God was calling us to hand out Bibles. But the problem was we didn't have any contacts. We didn't know anybody in Japan with Bibles. We didn't know where to get Bibles. It was just kind of a mystery. So we went into that outreach without knowing what to do. Stick with me to the end of the story, and I'm going to tell you how God got us the Bibles, put them in our hands so that we could actually hand them out to people. It's amazing. My name is JD Goding, and this is Understanding the Bible. The reason that I started this channel was to take small amounts of biblical text and just to simply mine the gold out of it so that your relationship with Jesus could only improve. And if you wouldn't mind hitting that like and subscribe button, I'd really appreciate it. It just helps get the message out further. In this part of the story, Jesus is about to blow the minds of the disciples. Now, they've just come back from being sent out 2 by 2, and they're exhausted. They've reported back to Jesus, and now they're headed to the next spot. When the disciples were reporting to Jesus, they would have told him about all the power stories that had happened, about all the healings and the demons leaving people, about how they preached the gospel, but they also would have told him about the rejections that they would have felt. And at this point, the disciples are just so tired. They're exhausted, they're depleted, and they're in need of serious rest. Jesus told them to come away with him and rest a while. But unfortunately for the boys, there was a bit of a disruption going on the land. So as they were sailing across, it says, "Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them." You see, what they thought was going to be a restful time with Jesus actually became an interruption. And this was common for Jesus. Jesus' whole ministry was just one interruption after the other. But I just can't get past how exhausted these guys would have been. You know, I can put myself in these guys' shoes, the murmuring, the whining, the complaining, and then seeing this huge crowd of people knowing that Jesus is going to address them. All they're thinking is, oh my gosh, more work. Now it's clear in the text, they're in a boat, but everybody else is running around on the shore. So they are getting that period of rest before they move into that next spot of ministry. And the people running would probably have been more exhausted than the disciples because they all of a sudden realized that Jesus is coming and they just pick up and run. And when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. The focus of this verse is not the disciples. Jesus had come with the gospel, the good news message. And Jesus, as the good shepherd, was going to teach his sheep, these people, this message. And like I said, when the people figured out that Jesus was on the boat, they ran hard and fast. They dropped everything and it was just a mad dash to get to wherever Jesus was going to be. Now, this isn't like they had time to prepare. This is not like a prepped camping trip. There's no food, there's no water bags, there's all kinds of things they don't have that they would need if they were making this kind of a voyage. They just saw Jesus and ran. You see, when Jesus saw their hunger, he was drawn to it. He saw those people running and he put aside his own needs to meet the people's needs because that's what Jesus did. And I think it's interesting that Jesus had compassion on these people because Jesus has compassion on us today. But here's the difference. After the ascension of Jesus, after his crucifixion and his resurrection, when he ascended into heaven, you see, Jesus is no longer limited by being zipped up in a man's suit. He has regained the glory and the honor of being the second person in the Godhead. And do you know what that means? He never gets tired. So we can always go to Jesus with any problem and he's there to listen to us. And when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a desolate place and the hour is now late. Send them away into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." Now at first that sounds like a reasonable request, but it actually isn't. It's completely selfish and it's actually a demanding statement. They were telling Jesus what to do, which is a problem. But what you also notice is nobody's complaining about being hungry. The disciples had no patience for the people, but Jesus does have patience. And he understood the needs of the people, and he wasn't going to be persuaded by the disciples' selfishness. Another interesting takeaway from this is when the disciples say, "send them away," this can also be translated as like, let them go free, as in like a divorce. So in a sense, what the disciples are saying is, Jesus, divorce yourself from these people. But Jesus doesn't do that because he's the good shepherd. And in reality, the size of these local villages that they wanted to send the people to were only a couple hundred people max. There's no way that the local economy could have have supported 10 to 20,000 extra people. It just wasn't physically possible. But yet the disciples were telling Jesus to divorce himself from the people because of their self-centered, selfish thinking. But he answered them, "You give them something to eat." And they said, "Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat?" This is the classic problem. The disciples want the people to leave, but Jesus does not want to leave his sheep. What good shepherd would walk away from his flock? The disciples wanted the people to go buy food, but Jesus wanted to actually give them food. You see, these people have been feasting on the words of Jesus all day long, and now he actually wants to feed them physically. But the disciples are thinking this is impossible for Jesus because this is outside of their box. But think about it. If Jesus can't feed his sheep, what kind of a shepherd is he? But look at their excuses. When they say 200 denarii, 200 denarii is 8 months' wage. So if you have someone that, let's say, just in our system, right, makes 60 grand a year, that's pretty average. You make 60 grand a year, that's $40,000. So what they're saying is, even if we had $40,000, we couldn't buy enough food for these people. What Jesus is calling them to do in their minds as the disciples is just completely impossible. And he said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." And when they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Here's something amazing about Jesus. He works through us in spite of us. Let that sink in. So many times I've been just like the disciples, selfish, self-centered, egotistical, bratty, but yet Jesus will still move through me. Jesus knows that about me, just like he knew the disciples' attitudes about them. But notice here, there isn't a reprimand. Jesus just simply asks, "What do you have?" And they said, 5 loaves and 2 fish. And when you're looking at a sea of 10 to 20,000 people, that doesn't go too far. This story proves that the disciples are completely incapable of doing what Jesus can do, and he's about to show you. Then he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups by hundreds and fifties. Okay, a couple things here. First, the reason that there's probably 50s and hundreds is because the men and the women would not eat together. They would always eat separately in this culture. And second, doesn't this sound a lot like Psalm 23? "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures." Jesus is showing these people right here that he is the Lord. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all, and they all ate and were satisfied. This is my favorite point in the story, and the reason why is I looked through it through the lens of the disciples. Okay, they're tired, they're angry, they've had it, and now Jesus is taking 2 small fish and 5 loaves of bread, and he thanks God, and then he breaks them apart. And we know later that there's baskets. So I'm imagining that the disciples are holding baskets, and Jesus walks by and just puts a piece of bread and a piece of fish in each one of the baskets. And then as soon as Jesus is done putting the last piece of bread into the last basket, the baskets completely fill with fish and bread. And my question is this: did any of the disciples drop the basket? Because if you have a basket and it's empty, you're not holding it that hard. But if you're holding a basket that's full of food, I mean, there's some weight to that. So did the baskets drop? And if so, was it funny? I think it would have been. So the disciples start going around and start handing out fish and bread to everybody. Like, this is a miracle. But here's the other thing. The more food that the disciples would distribute, the baskets would just never empty. Like, this is a miracle of miracles that's happening. And I can imagine, like, 5 minutes before, when the disciples were angry and they were frustrated, now they're jumping with joy because they've seen something that's never been done before. Nobody has ever produced mass bread and fish before like Jesus has just done. You see, their spiritual hunger had been satisfied through the words of Jesus, and then Jesus satisfied their physical hunger by doing this incredible miracle in front of them. And I think the attitude adjustment that took place that day in the disciples' heart was absolutely enormous. I think it happened in just a fraction of a second. One moment they're super angry, the next moment they're jumping with joy because they have never seen something like this take place before. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish, and those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. Now there's a lot of significance to 12 baskets, but I'm just going to give you one simple one. There was a basket left over for each disciple. Imagine that. They were hungry. They were just as hungry as everybody else, and Jesus gave them a basket full of food. Why? Because Jesus cared cared about them too. Jesus knew that they needed their protein, that they needed their carbs in order to continue. And what does Jesus do? He takes care of them. Jesus simply asked them for what they had. And what they had was 5 loaves and 2 fish. But that was enough for Jesus to move in the miraculous and feed thousands. Now, when I was on my mission trip in Japan, as a team, we would get together every morning and we felt like we were supposed to hand out Bibles. All of us had this impression that we were supposed to hand out Bibles, but the problem was we didn't have any contacts. And let me tell you, the difference between English and Japanese is quite a lot. So finding that kind of a person in a country where you don't speak the language is a big endeavor. But there was this one Sunday where we went to church, and then the pastor kindly invited all 12 of us as a team over to his house for dinner. And let me tell you, there is a difference between sushi in Japan and sushi anywhere else in the world. And in Japan, it is delicious. But during lunch, I was sitting next to this older lady who spoke English. And she asked me, like, what are you guys doing here? And so we told her, and then I asked her, what does she do? And she told me that she was the wife of the president of the Gideons for Asia. Now think about every hotel room you've ever stayed in. You open up the drawer next to the bed, and what's there? A Gideon Bible. Like God was answering our prayers. When she dropped that bit of knowledge on me, I stopped cold in my tracks, and I looked at her and I said, we have been praying for Bibles. We need Bibles. We do evangelism. We're going to the universities and we're going to the homeless shelters, but we don't have any biblical literature to give them. I said, can you help us? And after a bit more conversation, she agreed. And a few days later, boxes and boxes of Japanese Bibles showed up where we were staying. We used them in the trains. We used them in the universities. We used them in the places where ministry was happening. Everywhere that we were evangelizing, we were able to give a Bible to that person. Now, why did that happen? Well, that happened because we went to God and we asked him to do the impossible, because God is the God of the impossible. But if I'm going to be honest, 10 minutes before I sat down next to that lady, I was thinking this whole Bible thing is nothing but a pipe dream. It's just not going to happen. There's no way this is going to take place. And then all of a sudden, God did the impossible right in front of me. So where in your life do you need a miracle? Is it finances? Is it relationships? Is it a new ministry? Or is it like, I need food for tonight's dinner? Here is my humble advice. Get away by yourself or with your family and humbly ask God to do the miracle that you cannot do. Pray to Jesus and watch him work. But also remember this. What is God calling you to do? What food scraps is he saying, hey, I want you to do this for me? I mean, 5 loaves and 2 fish is absolutely nothing, but yet God fed thousands upon thousands with that. So if he's asking you to do something, or if he's asking you to give something away, just walk in obedience and see what God has for you. Thanks, and I hope this helps.